just because J.D. Vance said that the assassination attempt, which is a horrific and heinous act, I believe I've read it reported it's being investigated as an act of domestic terrorism. It is, at a minimum, a horrible security failure. If we can't protect the most powerful Republican in the country, I'm not sure how we convince foreign leaders to come. I mean, it's a horrific story, but there is absolutely no evidence that it has anything to do with anything President Joe Biden said or did, or anything that's been in the media that hasn't surfaced as a part of this story. And I wonder, I worry, I guess, and I'm sure Katie's simply reporting what she's hearing, that some of that disinformation is calcifying, at least in the room.
Yeah, it is. First of all, political violence is evil. And everyone I know who is not a Donald Trump supporter feels very strongly about condemning this violence. There is no one in the Democratic Party that thinks this would be anything other than an awful stain on our country and our ability to conduct free and fair elections. So having said that, I think it's really interesting that he picked J.D. Vance, because if this was going to be a moment where Donald Trump, because he came so close to a brush with death, that he was going to somehow pivot to a softer, more unifying message, then it seems to me he would have reached out to one of the many candidates for vice president that would have done what Katie referred to, and that is open the tent flap a little, let a few more people in, soften the edges. Instead, by picking J.D. Vance, who is a flamethrower, who is bombastic, who called Donald Trump cultural heroin 8 years ago, he has closed the flap, and they have now stitched it closed because they're not reaching out to a new group of people. And I think it's fascinating to me that he wanted someone more in his image, willing to say things, which I think was an irresponsible thing for J.D. Vance to say. That is not what the country needs right now. It needs everyone to say, let's quiet this down. Let's have policy differences. Let's don't make this something that stirs people's passions to the point that they take up a gun and try to kill someone. So I am not optimistic that we're going to see a pivot from Trump to a more unifying message, because if he was, he wouldn't have picked him. He wouldn't have picked J.D. Vance.
Well, and we also, like, at some point, if we're still looking for the pivot, the problem is us, right? I mean, Trump doesn't pivot. And I would say, just the cold, hard political calculation, if you look at where he is in the polls and you look at where he believes he'll be after that, I mean, the image of and thank God he wasn't injured in a manner that didn't allow him to walk off the stage, but the way he did it and the images that were captured are instantly iconic.
They are. So, look, first on J.D. Vance, I think you're already seeing the Biden team come out and say he's wrong on abortion services, reproductive freedom. He's wrong on health care, Social Security, January 6th, and protecting democracy. I think rather than flooding the zone with issues, the takeaway from the Vance announcement is that he's unqualified. It's a singular issue. He is unqualified to be president of the United States tomorrow. And where I think a conventional candidate, as Claire said, coming out of the events in Butler, Pennsylvania, would have selected somebody that could be president tomorrow, because that is front and center on the voters' mind now. You would have looked at a Burgum or a Rubio or a Tim Scott, or open up the process all over again. Donald Trump, having just narrowly survived an assassination attempt, is telling the country that he wants his vice president to be somebody that's wholly unqualified. A year in the Senate, that's it. And so on the issues, certainly it's going to be important to unpack Vance's record, but he's not qualified to be president. And I think he's opened up, Donald Trump has, a vulnerability politically to the Biden camp. I also think, I don't believe we will see Donald Trump, be a unifying figure over the coming months. We've seen with our own eyes over the last 8 years. I agree with everything that's been said. The assassination attempt requires national condemnation, shared condemnation. It requires national reflection. It requires our national sympathy. But Donald Trump would be mistaken to conflate national sympathy with national support, because nothing about Butler, Pennsylvania requires us to suspend our judgment and suspend reality. which is Donald Trump is someone who tried to instigate violence to stop democracy 4 years ago. That he did that, and we can condemn both incidents. He's also somebody who has suggested he would use the levers of the presidency for retribution. We can talk political issues day and night. We can draw the contrast on fundamental rights and freedoms that we know he would roll back. But it is okay to recognize we are in a very pivotal moment where democracy was almost interrupted in Butler, Pennsylvania by a bullet. Democracy was almost interrupted on January 6th. We have also seen other incidents of political violence with different victims. President Biden tried to allude to those. And just speaking clinically, because we do need to be sensitive about the politics of the moment, I think for many voters who think we've got to get past this chapter of chaos, who do you think truly in their ethos might be more unifying going into the next 4 years? Is it the Donald Trump that we have seen, or is it the Joe Biden? Is it that Republicans want to paint Joe Biden's weakness as being the steady, aging hand? Perhaps that's now his greatest strength, that's exactly what the country is looking for in a moment of chaos. I think this is a rallying moment for Republicans, certainly. It should be for the country on issues of condemning political violence and on self-reflection, national reflection. I don't think it's the unifying political moment that Republicans hope it is. We'll see.
It is interesting and important that everyone is, I think, shaken by how close this was. It is also our job to point out the difference in the response when Paul Pelosi was bludgeoned with a hammer. There was not a universal condemnation of that act of political violence.
No, in fact, there was an incredibly unfair attack on Paul Pelosi personally and on the Pelosi family. He was dragged through the mud, and allegations were made and repeated by people in responsible places that knew better.
Ex-President's son, Don Jr., had some hideous.
Just and they made jokes about it. So listen, there is a temptation to do finger pointing, and that's politics. There's a lot of finger pointing in politics, but I do not think the American people believe for one moment that Joe Biden was responsible, by and large. Now, the Trump loyalists may believe this, that somehow Joe Biden was responsible for this happening. What this really is a hardening of our politics, a coarseness of our politics. And I got to tell you the truth, I honestly know we can lay more of that at the foot of Donald Trump than we can of Joe Biden.
The whole reason Donald Trump needs a new VP is because he called Mike Pence the P word because he wouldn't be the final nail in his coup coffin, and then left him to die. His supporters wanted to, quote, hang Mike Pence.
And by the way, J.D. Vance has said he would not have certified those electors.
Can I show you what J.D. So J.D. Vance was actually confronted by Fox's Brett Baier about all the things J.D. Vance said about Donald Trump. Let me show you that.
Well, Senator, this is an evolution, and I know you've been asked about this before, about past comments that you've made about Donald Trump. You've said, I'm a never Trump guy, never liked him, terrible candidate, idiot if you voted for him, might be America's Hitler, might be a cynical a-hole, cultural heroine, noxious and reprehensible.
I was wrong about Donald Trump. I didn't think he was going to be a good president, Brett. He was a great president.
I don't know if the flip-flop doesn't make you throw up in your mouth, the sycophant he's turned into might.
Yeah, I think flip-flopping is baked in the Trump era for Republicans, sadly. As I mentioned, that's why I think the unqualified tag is important. But I think at the base of what you just raised about the reason J.D. Vance is now needed is because Donald Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence has been, disenfranchised by Republicans, but most of Donald Trump's cabinet won't support the former president either, for a fundamental reason. Because Donald Trump did try to topple democracy with violence, and Mike Pence refused to do it. And this is important to the context of what we saw in Butler. We don't know the shooter's motivations. Let's say it was political violence, politically motivated. That shooter almost interrupted democracy through violence, through a bullet. On January 6th, Donald Trump led an insurrection to interrupt democracy. Fortunately, nobody was killed, but the crowd was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and Donald Trump watched as that occurred. It is why
and sent out a tweet calling him, not the P word, but we know from Ivanka Trump's assistant that that's what he was saying in private.
And as I've said, the non-legal case here is Donald Trump laid the predicate of a stolen election, issued the invitation for the mob to come to Washington, gave a speech saying, "Go to the Capitol with strength, not with weakness." They only respond to strength. The crowd started chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." There were gallows on the lawn. Donald Trump watched. Donald Trump has tried to undermine our democracy and the American voter. The American experience is not guaranteed. Our experiment is only protected by the leaders we have. Donald Trump has shown not to be faithful to the American experiment. It's why Mike Pence is out and why he wants J.D. Vance to be a sycophant. It's also why, while we share in the national condemnation, we must not suspend our own judgment about who the candidates are in November.
Or our eyes and ears. And I think what I mean, you are so elegant, I'm going to be not elegant. If this were dating and Trump were the guy and the first girlfriend that was dating him was Mike Pence, and you say, well, you know, it's not you, it's him. I mean, he left you to actually die. They were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and he said, yeah, go for it, basically. You would warn the next guy that it might happen to you, too. But I actually can't get beyond, I mean, I've spent 8 years covering Donald Trump, and I've had a lot of critics of Donald Trump on, and a lot of people on the right want to point to the media's coverage. No one has been more vicious to Donald Trump than J.D. Vance. Listen to these insults. He called him a, quote, cynical a-hole. He called him, quote, cultural heroin. He called him, quote, America's Hitler. He said this, I mean, Hillary Clinton's campaign was injured because she called his supporters deplorable. J.D. Vance goes farther. J.D. Vance said this, quote, "You're an idiot if you voted for Donald Trump." He said he was a, quote, terrible candidate. He described himself as a, quote, never Trump guy who, quote, never liked him, Donald Trump.
Yeah, and the interesting thing here is what this says about J.D. Vance's character. Because he says, oh, well, I didn't realize what a great president he was going to be. I got news for everybody. J.D. Vance doesn't believe he was a great president. I don't know any Republican senators that believe that Donald Trump was a great president. And the people that were around him that provided some kind of measure of, no, you can't do that. You can't call out the military to attack protesters in America. And no, you can't do that. You can't go down to the border and just start shooting people. Those people are all gone. And the idea that they picked this guy shows that they're sure that he would never stand for the Constitution before he would stand for Donald Trump. Because he has said that Mike Pence, if he had been the vice president, he wouldn't have certified those electors.
Vaughn Hillard is with us. Vaughn, I think you were there 8 years ago when Donald Trump picked Mike Pence. Now, I don't know, I guess it took me 9 years to work up a well of sympathy for Mike Pence, but poor Mike Pence isn't even there tonight. He's been a lifelong Republican. Mike Pence went along with all of it up until, and then not including the coup. Your thoughts?
It's hard to get a much more loyal vice president, I think, than what Mike Pence was up until January 6, 2021. Loyal in terms of the way that Donald Trump views loyalty. I recall I was in Indianapolis when Mike Pence was formally selected there, and I remember the very first interview that he did after being named, and it was with Hannity, and Hannity asked him the question, what are you going to do in the White House when you disagree with Donald Trump? And he said at the time that behind closed doors, he would have that discussion and tell Donald Trump why he disagrees with him. But then when the doors open up, he would come out and stand shoulder to shoulder with the president. And for 4 years, he did exactly that until he did not go forward with Donald Trump's plan to reject the certification of the Electoral College votes on January 6th. And I covered Mike Pence as he went internationally around the country, 3 different foreign trips that I went around the world with him on, and every step of the way, I think he represented the Trump administration in the best light that he could in terms of the agenda and the way that the U.S. has typically been represented by U.S. presidential administrations of both parties. And so I think to get to this point here with J.D. Vance, I think it shows the level of forgiveness that Donald Trump is willing to offer those who come back to him within this Republican Party. And when, Mike Pence made the decision to go and challenge Donald Trump for the presidency, he well knew that it was going to be an uphill battle. He had watched Liz Cheney handily lose, overwhelmingly lose, in her primary against Harriet Hageman. He watched candidate after candidate go and try to stand up to, the Trump-backed candidates, and yet he still went forward with running for the presidency himself. Mike Pence is not here in Milwaukee today, and of course he sent condolences to Donald Trump here. This is the apparent assassination, which I just want to underscore as somebody who has covered these rallies over the last 9 years. I think underscores the anxiety that myself as a reporter and so many feel about the state of being able to go out on the campaign trail in the year of 2024. But I think Mike Pence also experienced to a certain degree that fear himself a couple years ago. And so this is a moment that I don't think our story, we don't understand exactly where it's going. We're living in it in this present time on July 15th, 2024, Nicole.
Vaughn Hilliard, I know you've been reading Project 2025 sort of page by page. It's 900 pages, 600 pages long. Would J.D. Vance and his past statements, let me read them again. You're an idiot if you voted for Trump. He might be America's Hitler. He's a cynical a-hole. He's cultural heroin, obnoxious and reprehensible.
Right.
Would he pass the loyalty test as outlined by John McEntee and the folks that created Project 2025 to work in a Trump administration if he wasn't the VP pick?
I'm not sure what the statute of limitations is on statements for the team that is putting that personnel together. But let me tell you why J.D. Vance is intriguing real fast, in a nutshell, if I could, for the Project 2025 folks. And that's because of the ability to make civil servants and turn them into political appointees. J.D. Vance has been on the front lines of articulating that, in his words, that 90% of the federal workforce, in his words, are liberals, that at the department and agency level have been barriers to being able to implement conservative policies, and that the Trump administration for 4 years was not able to be as effective as they wanted to be because of liberals, in the words of J.D. Vance, who were in the executive branch under departments and agencies. And J.D. Vance, over the last 2 years, has been on the front lines of calling for what is known Schedule F. This is something that Donald Trump signed as an executive action in October of 2020, just before leaving the White House, which converted a great share of federal workers and made them political appointees so that they would be more easily able to be fired and replaced by conservatives who, again, Project 2025 building this personnel database led by his former director of personnel in the White House, where they would be able to know who is coming in so they could make a more efficient 4 years for Donald Trump. J.D. Vance is somebody who is very astute in understanding how that vision could be implemented at the department and agency levels for a second Trump administration.
Just a few moments ago, Donald Trump officially became the Republican nominee for president for the 3rd time in a row. And just moments before that, he announced on Truth Social that he has selected Ohio Senator J.D. Vance to be his running mate. The start of the Republican National Convention taking place at an incredibly tense and volatile moment for the entire country. Less than 48 hours after an assassination attempt on the ex-president, a shooting that left 1 person dead, 2 others critically injured. If we see Donald Trump today, it will be his first public appearance since that horrific and tragic incident. It is violence that is deeply corrosive to our democracy. We all unequivocally condemn it in the strongest terms possible. And as my colleague Rachel Maddow puts it, quote, there is no violent solution to any American political conflict. We would also like to extend our sympathies to the family of Corey Compatore. He was tragically killed while shielding his family, while keeping his family safe from the gunfire that erupted at that rally. No one should ever be at risk when they attend a political rally. An investigation by the FBI is now underway. President Joe Biden has addressed the nation 3 times over the last 2 days, calling for all Americans to lower the temperature. In an address from the Resolute desk last night, he'll be sitting down with NBC's Lester Holt for an interview that airs later tonight right here on MSNBC. And believe it or not, there's more. More news, that is. In a stunning decision that is likely to set up another high-stakes legal battle, Judge Aileen Cannon has dismissed the Trump classified documents case in its entirety. The case is done from her perspective. In her ruling, she decides that the appointment of special counsel Jack Smith was in and of itself unconstitutional. Washington Post reports that the Department of Justice is highly likely to appeal the decision, and reports that the case could very well wind up before the United States Supreme Court. We'll have full coverage of that decision and its fallout later in the broadcast. But we return now to Milwaukee, where the nominating process is still underway. Later in this hour, delegates will formally nominate J.D. Vance as a Republican candidate for vice president. Joining us now in Milwaukee at the RNC, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard and MSNBC anchor Katy Tur. Here with me at the table for the hour, former U.S. Senator, co-host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill, and former Congressman and MSNBC political analyst David Jolly. Vaughn Hilliard, what have you got?
Well, we've got the fact that J.D. Vance of Ohio is going to be the running mate for Donald Trump here, potentially serving in the capacity that Vice President Mike Pence once served. Of course, Mike Pence of Indiana is not apparently here for this week, but J.D. Vance, who has only served now 18 months in the U.S. Senate, we expect here potentially any moment is going to be making his way down this aisle here to potentially take the stage. This would be the first time that we see J.D. Vance here in Ohio. Of course, this is the man who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, rose to prominence as the author, and was a one-time deep public critic of Donald Trump, calling his rhetoric abhorrent and somebody who he referred to as an idiot, somebody who he was led to suggest that he would vote for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump in 2016. And yet, in so many ways, J.D. Vance is the story of the modern Republican Party. Somebody who 8 years ago said that he was a never-Trump Republican, here in 2024 is about to become formally the running mate to Donald Trump to serve in the capacity of Vice President of the United States for the next 4 years. And for J.D. Vance and his allies, he saw Don Jr. as one on the front lines. I had the chance to ask Don Jr. about this election, and he, behind the scenes, had suggested that this was an effort there. It's somebody who he knows will be loyal and somebody who will be able to be effective in working and carrying out the policies of Donald Trump. Of course, I was talking to Senator Tuberville of Alabama, who said for the 18 months he had worked to build up a collegiate relationship with his colleagues, a good relationship with those Republican members of the Senate. If they are able to take the Senate majority Republicans here in 3.5 months, of course, J.D. Vance could be an effective conduit for Donald Trump in that capacity come 2025.
Vaughn Hilliard, I feel like in that perfect bit of reporting on the arc of J.D. Vance, and I'm all for arcs, I've been through one myself in my political journey, he also described Donald Trump as America's Hitler. And it's notable because he was the first person to come out and point to the media and Democrats with some of their commentary about Donald Trump for his own critiques of Donald Trump. They're notable not just because he was so completely against him, but the language was some of the most vitriolic language used against Donald Trump by Republicans at the time.
Right. I think that this is, when you look at the aftermath, let's be very clear. The attempted assassination was less than 48 hours ago. And for the likes of J.D. Vance, if you compare it and contrast it to Doug Burgum, the North Dakota governor who was under consideration, Doug Burgum came out with a statement that was much more in lines of sending prayers to Donald Trump and his family during this time here. And on the other hand, J.D. Vance was quite explicit in his social media post, saying that the Biden administration and the rhetoric that Donald Trump was a threat to democracy and a fascist, that was what contributed to an individual taking aim at Donald Trump here. the stakes of what we are talking about are so high, and clearly we were talking about what kind of individual would Donald Trump look in a running mate. We've had that conversation ever since Mike Pence was booted in the aftermath of January 6th. And we knew that he would look for somebody who was loyal, and that is where you saw a cadre of individuals, from Senator Tim Scott, who was a one-time, I think, reticent Republican towards Donald Trump, come out on the campaign trail in New Hampshire and campaign repeatedly for him. Doug Burgum, somebody who said 1 year ago that he wouldn't go into business with Donald Trump in a business capacity 1 year ago, come out and seek the endorsement. Marco Rubio, who 8 years ago covered on the campaign trail when he suggested that he had third world leader, strongman type rhetoric. He going seeking this vice presidency. I think it speaks to the way that Donald Trump has effectively shaped this Republican Party and in his image over the last 8 years. And Nicole, we had conversations in 2022 when J.D. Vance was running for the U.S. Senate. He was not the only Republican running for that Ohio Senate seat. There were several other candidates seeking Donald Trump's endorsement, yet he got the Trump-backed endorsement. And almost every single one of those Trump-backed candidates in 2022 won their Republican primaries. And then, of course, the general election was a different story. The people like Carrie Lakes and Tudor Dixon, they didn't win in November. But J.D. Vance, he was the one unusual Trump-backed candidate. He did win. And ever since winning that Senate seat, he has been loyal to Donald Trump, in his corner, early endorser of him in his presidential run when some sat on the sidelines, when the likes of Governor DeSantis and Nikki Haley were still in this. J.D. Vance, clearly, he returned the favor very clearly after winning that Senate seat with Donald Trump's endorsement, and in turn endorsed Donald Trump. And now here in the heart of July, in the summer of 2024, he has been named, J.D. Vance, the running mate to Donald Trump in 2024.
Donald Trump is in an era right now, a moment, where he's trying to convince Americans who are on the fence or Americans who aren't excited about the Democratic ticket that he's softer than he really is. Don't worry. You know, I'm going to shift this position on abortion after already taking your rights away. This is the real Trump movement, what we're seeing today. I hope Americans are clear about that. J.D. Vance is even farther to the right, as you said a few moments ago, Nicole, than Donald Trump is. And I think as Trump tries to distance himself from Project 2025, this pick is going to make that even more difficult.
If I can just say very quickly, Mara's point, there's something I want to build off of, because I'm a Gen Xer. If you think of Gen Xers and millennials, we were the ones who we're children of white flight. We're the children of the civil rights movement. It was sort of our job, working across the aisle and across race and ethnicity, to try to, as somebody said earlier, implement all that was done before us into our neighborhoods, into our institutions. And what we've seen over the course of the last several years, particularly as a backlash to the Obama presidency, but even before that, is just a deepening and a hardening of positions where there is no incentive, a disincentive, in fact, to have the kinds of conversations that we were talking about. And so I just, even as a person that does a lot of education policy, even the fact that we could be dealing with this in K-12 education, in civics classes, in debate classes, and we don't, is partly what led to, or what is leading to this incredible divide that certainly J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have worked to exploit in many ways. And that's why over the last week I've been saying, if you're a Democrat, you have to come to this fight with your chest out and your back straight. This is about, as you were saying earlier, signs of strength. You know, how are we going to fight this? How is that going to get pushed back? And it doesn't happen by having these broad conversations you shouldn't be having out in the open. But having said that...
Like what? Say more.
Well, no, just that, look, there were a lot of people that were calling for Joe Biden to step down, and in the same breath were not saying that the person next should be Kamala Harris. And I wonder why. Because in many ways,
Who did that?
Well, I think most of the people that came out to say Joe Biden should step down did not come right out and say that Kamala Harris should be next. And
Kamala Harris should be next if anyone thinks that Joe Biden should step down.
Kamala Harris should be next.
Let me just say this is someone that's covered her. If anyone has watched, I've watched all of her speeches for the last 2 weeks.
She's been fantastic.
I thought she was fantastic 4 years ago. Anyone that hasn't watched, I hope that J.D. Vance today challenges Kamala Harris to 6 debates, because she would wipe the floor with him. She's hidden for whatever. I will stay out of what the Democrats decide to do at the top of the ticket. But if they make a change, Kamala Harris should be at the top of the ticket.
Absolutely right. And I don't mean to bring up something that seems to be subsided a bit.
We got to work it all out, and we got to do it on TV. Keep talking.
No, we should, because the reality is that, and I've said this, that I don't know if my party knows even how to defend her when the attacks come.
Well,
and they will come.
Have them call
and
me.
They will
have
come.
them call me.
And they will come.
Let me just say this. I have only covered her, and I think this is where my
that's fine.
You have covered her, and you watched her dismantle Bill Barr. How many people can say they, like, you put your list of accomplishments together, and if you can put on it, destroyed Bill Barr, made fun of Mike Pence and the fly on his head without saying a word, and have hit the campaign trail with enough vigor to carry the whole ticket for the last 16 days, she's ready.
And absolutely right. I've written about it. I've talked about it. And what concerns me, and it goes back to your point about signs of strength, the party can do this. The party can do this. They can fight this fight. They can push back. Project 2025.
Who should lead the ticket then, in your view? You started the conversation.
I've been saying since the beginning, I'm with Joe Biden. As long as he's in, I'm in. I mean, there's no question in my mind.
Should he be in?
If he wants to stay in, he should stay in. He's got, 3,896 delegates, and he said, come take them. And I'm not going to be the one to suggest that somebody should go do that. And if we go back just for a quick second to Project 2025, because this is where, if Donald Trump wants to distance himself from it, the person that we're talking about, J.D. Vance, is the person to implement it, if not him, and get everybody in line on the ground to make sure that that's all implemented. And so when in my conversations and just in talking to voters about what's coming next, it's important not to just focus on Donald Trump, but in every implementer that he appoints, because these are the folks that are going to be day-to-day transforming our institutions. I go back to the point I always make. It's 180 days from day one.
Exactly. An eventful beginning to the Republican National Convention. Trump has officially been chosen by the delegates as the party's presidential nominee, and he has officially selected his VP. It's Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. Vance is expected to be formally nominated any moment now. President Joe Biden's campaign putting out a statement on Trump's selection, which reads in part, quote, Donald Trump picked J.D. Vance as his running mate because Vance will do what Mike Pence would not do on January 6th, bend over backward to enable Trump and his extreme MAGA agenda, even if it means breaking the law and no matter the harm to the American people, end quote. Today's developments set against the tragic backdrop of an attempted assassination on Saturday, an attack that is being investigated as an act of domestic terrorism. Saturday's shooting left one person dead and two others critically injured. We condemn what took place in the strongest terms possible. Violence has no place in our political discourse or in our politics. It's a pivotal moment in America's history where the stakes of the November election have never been higher or clearer, and it's where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. NBC News national and political correspondent Jacob Soboroff is with us. He's in Milwaukee on the floor of the Republican National Convention. With us at the table, Democratic strategist, professor at Columbia University, MSNBC political analyst Basil Smikle, New York Times editorial board member, MSNBC political analyst Mara Gay is here. And lucky for us, former Republican congressman, MSNBC political analyst David Jolly stuck around, and Claire McCaskill did as well. Jacob Soboroff, I come to you first. What are you seeing and hearing?
Nicole, I'm probably about 10, 15, 20 yards at the most from J.D. Vance right now, who's over in the Ohio delegation, getting ready to accept the nomination as former President Trump's vice presidential running mate. We last heard from him quite outspoken, speaking out against the Biden administration, quite frankly, in the wake of the assassination attempt on former President Trump's life. People here are excited, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. He's a young man, 39 years old. He's a millennial from a generation born in the 1980s at the oldest. He and Vice President Kamala Harris represent a new generation of American politics, but I think that's about where the similarities end. He's, of course, if anybody's read Hillbilly Elegy, from a family that has suffered, like so many across the country, from overdose and addiction within his family. That nomination is happening right now. But if you listen to him talk closely, his solutions for these problems are related to immigration. They're not related to the substance abuse disorder that so many people are talking about. And that's why President Biden, is talking about him as an extreme MAGA Republican. I'm going to let everybody hear from him and from the folks up here in just a little bit. But I have to tell you, it was unexpected, I think. He was in the mix. But today, a lot of people were surprised that it ended up being J.D. Vance from the state of Ohio. We're going to wait right here, Nicole. We're going to see if we can try to catch him on his way out. And if that happens, it'll happen in just a couple of minutes. Nicole?
Jacob, are the folks there sort of aware of some of the things that Fox's own Bret Baier has confronted J.D. Vance with in the most generous terms? Bret Baier describing it as an evolution, that he called Donald Trump a cynical a-hole, cultural heroine, and America's Hitler.
Yeah, he also called him an idiot, Nicole, and I think that vociferous opposition to former President Trump is going to be something that J.D. Vance will have to answer for. And, of course, I'm sure he's prepared to answer those questions. He wasn't picked by former President Trump because of an inability to answer those questions. They've certainly reconciled. They've come together on issues like manufacturing and the decimation of the Rust Belt. But like I said, their solutions, those solutions to those issues are ones that the Democratic Party certainly view as extremist MAGA policies, and that's, I think, ultimately we're now seeing the setup of what that debate is going to look like. And that's the nomination. Let's take a quick listen.
Sure.
No no's.
And the motion is adopted.
The ayes have it. The motion's adopted. J.D. Vance is now the official nominee of the Republican Party to be the vice presidential candidate alongside Donald Trump. And now the debate over policy begins, Nicole, including some of those issues that you mentioned very clearly, his vociferous opposition to Donald Trump when Donald Trump was a nascent candidate for president of the United States.
Basil Smikle, your thoughts as you watch this?
Well, you know, the word that I think some people will say is that he has evolved in his positions. I mean, he changed his mind, plain and simple. And he changed his mind out of political expediency. This is a man who raised money for January 6th defendants. I mean, let's be very clear that what Donald Trump, there was a statement that, this might have been a surprise, but, if Donald Trump was looking for somebody that was A, conservative, B, represented the state of Ohio, in thinking that maybe that would help him in some of those other states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and someone who was very, very, very quick to blame Joe Biden for the shooting right after the assassination attempt. And to me, that signaled this is a man that has Donald Trump's back no matter what. And if Donald Trump had seen that, weeks ago or felt that weeks ago, there was no doubt in my mind that this was going to be the kind of person he would choose, but certainly the person he was going to choose now that we know.
David Jolly, there's something so normal about the stagecraft of a convention, any party's convention, that's so jarring against the backdrop of the moment.
It is. Look, for J.D. Vance, I think he's where Marco Rubio was 15 years ago, which is on the leading edge of the Republican political trend. It's just very different. Marco Rubio is on the leading edge of the Tea Party movement, and let's eliminate cabinet departments and lower taxes, less regulation, all that stuff, with kind of the hard right edge. J.D. Vance is on the leading edge of where Donald Trump has delivered this party 8 years after coming down the elevator. And I think what is most shocking about this convention to me, there's kind of the suspension of reality that we are now here 8 years later, that of all the conventions you and I have probably been to, there used to be platforms with policies that at least made sense in the conservative world. What is remarkable about this convention is what it's devoid of, because it's been replaced with this cult of personality that allows a J.D. Vance to move in through nothing more than through loyalty, blind loyalty, if you will, to Donald Trump and Trumpism. And I think that will be the theme of this entire convention. It's a weird moment in Republican history.
Claire?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about whether conventions should even continue. They're expensive.
Well, we didn't have them 4 years ago.
Yes, we did not have them 4 years ago. And, I've been to my share. And I maybe would put myself in that camp of why do we have them. Now, and this was, by acclamation. There was no discussion. The platform does not reflect this candidate's view on abortion because Donald Trump had the platform changed. in the most cynical move you could possibly imagine after he delivers a death knell to essential women's freedoms in this country, him personally doing it, wanting to do it, campaigning on doing, bragging about doing it. Now he wants to soften the platform. So it is really interesting to me that this party is, you're not going to see the Republicans featured on the dais that the old Republican Party would feature. You're not going to see someone who stands up for Ukraine on that dais. This is a guy who fought Mitch McConnell over aid to Ukraine. This is a guy who wants us to be an isolationist country. That wasn't the Republican Party platform that you knew when you were involved in Republican politics. So there won't be anybody on that dais that is about capitalism, free trade, leading the world, voice of freedom, setting an example for the rest of the world. It's going to be about isolationism. It's going to be about cultural issues. And that's not the Republican Party that a lot of Republicans are comfortable with.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.